Hello and welcome to the Khayrion podcast, your guide to everything concerning the politics and business of the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. Hello and welcome, dear listeners. In one of our previous podcasts, we discussed the general outlines of the current situation in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, where it came from, how it got where it is now, and the most pressing issues of its domestic policies. We promised you, dear listeners, to present a separate podcast introducing Saudi Arabia's foreign relations, their challenges, and why they matter toward politics. So let's start. My name is Katarina Somogyova. I'm the CEO of Khayrion. And my dear guests today are Dr. Erzsébet N. Rózsa. Welcome.
Nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
And Professor László Csicsmann.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you very much for being here. So let's start. How would you briefly characterize Saudi Arabia's foreign relations? Just pro-Western, or is it a US ally, etc.?
Well, Saudi Arabia is relatively new kingdom in the sense that the first statehood that was formed in what is today Saudi Arabia goes back to the 18th century, which is not very far. If we consider that on the southern edge of the peninsula and on its northern parts in connection to the Levant, there have been for several thousands of years organized statehoods and organized communities. This does not mean that there was no life before that in this part, and especially we have to emphasize the role that Mecca and Medina, the two main cities for the whole of the Muslim community, for the whole of the Ummah, this almost 2 billion people globally, are the focal points, and they are in Saudi Arabia, and that the trade routes that were connecting Africa and all through the Arab Peninsula up to the Levant has been a very lively and continuously operating trade route all through human history. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that is there today, however, is a relatively modern development, and one of the basic founding ideas was, especially with reference to Mecca and Medina, the statehood was based originally on a kind of an alliance, a very close relationship between the House of Saud, this family that has become by now including several thousands of members, and then Ibn Abdel Wahhab, a religious preacher, and his family. So this is a kind of this was at the beginning at least, and still today it has a very important role, a kind of distribution of labor, if I may say so. The family, the Saudi family, the House of Saud giving the Sultan the secular power, while religious power is provided by the descendants of this Ibn Abdel Wahhab preacher, whose interpretation of Islam is not only within the Sunni Islam fold, but also it is considered to be a relatively conservative interpretation where the main aim or the ideal aim is the restoration of the Prophet's community, the Prophet's life. Obviously, in modern times, this has several other meanings. And what is interesting that till today, the religious sphere has a very, very important role in the Saudi state. And we should not forget that the Saudi state attracts millions and millions of people, pilgrims every year, not only for the official dates of the Hajj, of the pilgrimage, these 5 days per year, but also there are the small pilgrimage, the Umrahs, which are open all through the year. So millions of Muslims visit Saudi Arabia, especially with the aim of a pilgrimage. And of course, Saudi Arabia has become also a business focal point, and then maybe we come back to politics and security politics afterwards.
Let me continue with the foreign policy question. In terms of alliances, the Middle East used to have two large alliances in the region, and one is the so-called moderate Arab state, with leading by Saudi Arabia, and we have, on the other hand, the axis of resistance, in which Iran is the leading state. And we have to say that is the United States is the main supporter of the Saudi-led moderate Arab camp, and on the other side we have Russia and many other external players in the Middle East. So Saudi Arabia's foreign policy, the last 2 or 3 decades, is very close to the United States. However, we see a rapid change in the Middle East, and not only in the Middle East, but we have to emphasize the shifting international order phenomenon, especially the US-China rivalry competition. At the very same time, China has signed the highest level of cooperation agreement with the Chinese state, which is the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Agreement, but at the same time, Saudi Arabia still has very strong ties to the United States. Especially, I used to say that still the United States is the main security provider in the region, and it is true for Saudi Arabia. And what Saudi Arabia would like to avoid is to trap in this US-China competition, the so-called trade war, but it tries to really focus its foreign policy more on how to benefit from these cooperation. It's very much important to emphasize Saudi's role in the regions. It's not only a member, but it's the leading force of the Gulf Cooperation Council, the regional group which was established in 1981 at the height of the Iraq-Iran war. So it was an important, mainly security cooperation, but today it is more than just a security cooperation. It's important to mention that Saudi Arabia invited to join to the BRICS, but as far as I know, until today, there is no response from the Saudi state. It's maybe hesitating or not, we don't know, but I think it's an important opportunity for Saudi Arabia. But of course, there is a US critics regarding getting closer to China as well. Of course, as one of the largest oil exporter states, it's important to mention the group of oil exporters, OPEC, which is important in coordinating production quotas and prices as well. Plus, we have an OPEC Plus mechanism in which Saudi Arabia cooperates with Russia, and especially it's very important to balance the production and the world oil prices. Saudi Arabia is, of course, interested in higher oil prices because of budgetary concerns. So it's very important because it has a Vision 2030 policy, which is important, of course, to implement. It's a partner in the Islamic Development Bank and, of course, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is, the larger so-called Islam world. As my colleague, Dr. Erzsébet Rózsa mentioned, it is very important that Saudi Arabia tries to be the regional leader, not only in the political and security sense, but in terms of soft power, in which Islam is an important driving force of its foreign policy. So it has a very complex, I would say, foreign policy and economic policy in the region.
Now, let's zoom in on one of the most complex and widely discussed relationships in the region between Saudi Arabia and Iran. These two powerhouses have a long history of tensions and conflicts. Could you, in a nutshell, provide our listeners with a comprehensive overview of this intricate relationship, Dr. Rózsa?
Let us focus a little bit on the Persian Gulf. Saudi Arabia and Iran are looking into eye to eye across the Gulf, across the waters of the Gulf. But we have to mention that in modern history, let's say in the 20th century, or maybe even the 19th, there were 3 regional powers in the Gulf. It was Iraq, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. While the two powers, Iraq and Iran, were fighting an 8-year-long war from 1980 to 88. Saudi Arabia and the other small Gulf Arab states, by the way, all of them monarchies, found the chance to establish the GCC, as my colleague László Csicsmann has just mentioned. And this GCC consists of 6 Gulf Arab states, all monarchies. I would just like to mention that out of the Persian Gulf, there are only 2 monarchies in the whole of the Arab world among the 21 states, which is Jordan and Morocco, of course. So the GCC consists of 6 Arab states, all situated, all located in the Persian Gulf. These are Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman. And if we look at them size-wise, both according to territory and on the basis of the number of population, Saudi Arabia is by far the biggest and largest, and from this point of view, probably the most prestigious. So this is why we usually say that Saudi Arabia is kind of the leader of the GCC, although in principle, all the members are equal. Now, with Iraq, after 2003, the war in Iraq practically disconnected from this regional power game. Saudi Arabia and Iran remained. However, for a long while, Saudi Arabia was rather silent in political issues, rather withdrawn from open political issues. This is not always true because in signal issues like the Palestinian issues or even the Arab Peace Initiative, time and again it was there and it could be heard, but somehow we didn't get the impression that it is always there in each and every Arab case, in spite of the fact that it is one of the, and it used to be one of the most prestigious Arab states. Today we could say it is the number one, the leading force. But all through the 20th century, with the huge waves of Arab nationalism, a monarchy type could not participate in the same way. So now Saudi Arabia was in a way also forced into take up the leading position. And the leading position and the controversy with Iran is on the one hand explained by the difference between Sunni Islam, to which the main seat is Saudi Arabia, a rather conservative, as I tried to explain before, a rather conservative interpretation of Sunni Islam. And on the other hand, Iran, which has been since 1501 a Shiite state. Persia has been a Shiite state and is a Shiite state ever since. This is not to say that there are no Sunni communities within Iran. There are approximately some 8% of the population. Some of them are living in farther away from the Persian Gulf, in southern eastern Iran, close to the Pakistani border. And some of them live more along the Iraqi-Iranian border and not so much down along the Gulf, but there are also some on the Gulf. Vice versa, on the Saudi side, and on the Arab side of the Persian Gulf, even in Saudi Arabia, there are, if not too many, but there are meaningful Shiite communities. And what is most important, that these Shiite communities are located in the oil-rich territories of Saudi Arabia, to the impact that many of the workers in the Saudi oil fields are related to the Shiite community. And there was a very distinct case, I think it was in 2016, when in Saudi Arabia a Shiite leading personality was executed, and then a huge controversy started. So probably this was the initiator of the last phase of the decrease in the relations, because time and again, the Saudis and the Iranians realized that they have to coexist. They just cannot avoid it. I remember that President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad visited Iran at one point, and he was walking, you can look up the photos, he was Iran's president for 2 terms between 2005 and 2013. This must have been around 2006 or 7. There were even negotiations among the Gulf Arab states and Iranian proposals on the table to have a Persian Gulf security structure or institution, and Ahmadi was walking arm in arm with the Saudi King Abdullah, and he called him Ya Ammi, my uncle, and so on. But then this event in 2016 was a huge dividing line. And in the follow-up in Tehran, the Saudi embassy was attacked by angry people, and diplomatic relations were cut for several years. But relatively recently, negotiations, I think in 2020 or 21, started on and off, and it resulted in a kind of agreement, coming to an arrangement on coexistence, because we have to share, we have to live together anyhow. And the final negotiations in this series of negotiations was concluded in Beijing, and it was announced from China, which symbolically gave a great push to the Chinese eventual role in the Middle East.
Yeah, we used to call the Middle East as the most penetrated region, and we have seen the gradual disengagement of the United States from the region. And I think it's very important to emphasize that China, Russia, India, and other players have been trying to fill the vacuum in the Middle East. And for Saudi Arabia, I think it's very important to balance its relations. What I used to call as a foreign policy of strategic hedging, borrowing the word from business when you hedge the risk. And this foreign policy is about maximizing your benefits and decreasing the risk to lose something. And as I mentioned, and my colleague mentioned, that China has been playing a very important role in terms of foreign trade as well, because it's important to mention the statistics. China imports around half of its oil import from the Middle East. So there is a strong dependency on Middle East oil. And from the 50%, the largest share Saudi Arabia has in the Chinese oil import. On the other hand, it's important to mention that the United States is not anymore dependent, as it was previous decades, on Middle Eastern fossil fuels, the natural gas or oil. So it's rapidly changed, and we see a kind of Asianization of those countries' foreign policy and foreign trade. And this is not just their decision, but I think it's due to the shifting world order, and there is a center of gravity of the world economy moving from the west to the east. So it's somewhere located in the Indo-Pacific region now. And I think it is quite normal decision to have foreign trade relations with those countries. Today, Saudi Arabia's largest trading partner is China. So it's not a coincidence because of this oil trade. But of course, it's not only because of oil is important, the Chinese-Saudi relations, but many other things, foreign direct investment, and especially nowadays, technology, renewable energy, for instance, Chinese investment in renewable energy in Saudi Arabia. I think it's a much more long-term goal, both for China and for Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia adopted the Vision 2030 policy, which is about diversifying its economy and not relying mostly on oil income, but diversifying the economic structure. And here renewable has been playing a very important role. So China is there in a lot of spheres in the country. Of course, United States is an important trading partner as well, but other Asian states getting more and more important. For instance, very recently, Saudi Arabia has signed a strategic agreement with South Korea. It was this year, February, which was a defense agreement. Now it's more general agreement that South Korea will provide ammunition and weapons to the Saudi state. Although South Korea is an ally of the United States, but however, we see that it's somehow challenging the hegemony of the United States as a security provider in the Middle East. And it seems that very dynamically we see a rapid transformation from all different sections of economy and defense as well. And I think it's a very important issue. Of course, there is a huge risk, I think, from a US perspective, because China is there in critical infrastructure, emerging technologies like AI, which is very important, or it is important to mention Huawei with the 5G technology. And we see a lot of concern from the US side, not allow China to influence too many things there. And of course, trying to put a pressure on the Saudi state to distance a bit from China.
How would you actually describe the Saudi-China relationship in the light of the US-China global rivalry?
As I mentioned, the US-China competition is going on, and it seems the Saudis trying to avoid to be trapped in this US-China competition. As I mentioned, it is important for them to maximize all the benefit and minimizing the risk. And I think in some points, it's important that there are some common goals, for instance, fighting against terrorism. But on the other hand, we see a huge competition in the Middle East, and especially, as I mentioned, this technology is now a very critical issue, and the United States can put pressure on Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, two most important countries in terms of these emerging technologies, and especially with freezing some very modern military equipments purchase for Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, because there is a concern, as I mentioned, that maybe they're going to resell some technologies to Russia or China. And especially it's not a concern only about Huawei and the 5G technology, but semiconductors, of course. Saudi is trying not to purchase, because they don't have their own production, semiconductors and supercomputers, which are very important to provide different networks. And of course, the main source is the United States companies usually. And it seems there are negotiations going on. The US companies used to say there is a precondition which you should distance a bit from China in that relation. And I think it's a huge concern for Saudi Arabia, because it doesn't want to see the country trapped in this US-China competition.
Before the current war in Gaza broke out, many experts were watching with cautious optimism the process of normalizing the ties between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Where does the situation stand now, Dr. Rózsa?
It is a very difficult question, because the Palestinian issue has been very high on the agenda of all the previous Saudi rulers and of King Salman, who is the king of Saudi Arabia at the moment, in spite of the fact that he is relatively withdrawn from everyday and visible politics. It is his son, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who is widely seen around, who is widely considered to be the ruler in practice of Saudi Arabia, and he is the Crown Prince. So all through last year, 2023, there was a very strong source of news relating on Saudi Arabia and Israel eventually coming to conclude a so-called Abraham Agreement. Now, Abraham Agreement was a series of agreements between 4 Arab countries in 2020, between the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco and Sudan, which in principle foresaw the result that these Arab states have come to acknowledge the existence of the State of Israel in return for some bilateral relations, opening diplomatic relations, and as a third partner, the United States usually was there and offered something plus to these countries. Now, of course, the big prize would have been to have Saudi Arabia conclude such an agreement with Israel. And it was especially important because Saudi Arabia, as I mentioned before, was the Arab state that represented and has represented ever since 2002 the probably one and only joint Arab opinion that was called the Arab Peace Initiative, that in return for acknowledgement of Israel the state of Israel. Israel should withdraw behind the ceasefire lines of 1967. Now, this has not been realized, and we know it for certain that the present king, King Salman, is still very much committed to this issue, which means that his son cannot go against his obvious will, and also the Arab Peace Initiative. And with the war in Gaza, it seems that negotiations towards an eventual Abraham Accord between Saudi Arabia and Israel have been suspended. Interestingly, they have not been cut. They have not been pushed into the dustbin, but they have been suspended. Now, this Abraham Accord cannot be realized without the conditions or the requests or demands that Saudi Arabia has put to the United States. And these were usually 3 items plus a move forward on the Palestinian issue. With regard to the Gaza war, the situation has changed, that in case of an eventual restart of any discussion on the topic, the Palestinian statehood has come to the fore of the agenda. But the other 3 points were very, very important. And interestingly, these points were not addressed at Israel. These were the demands to the United States. One thing was that the United States, as my colleague László Csicsmann has just mentioned, the United States should sell the most modern weapons to Saudi Arabia so that Saudi Arabia could credibly defend itself in case there is an attack. No one says from which side, but many people think that possibly from Iran. But with the last year's agreement that we referred to already, at the moment, this is out of the picture. But never say never. So most modern weapons, which so far there is an accepted issue which says that the US sells the most modern weapons to Israel only in the region. Now, with the Abraham Accord, the United Arab Emirates was aiming at overseeing this mantra. Then the second one would be reliable defense. The Saudis have learned it on their own coast that in 2021 there were attacks on a Saudi oil field and a refinery, Abqaiq, and the United States did not come to defend Saudi Arabia. So now the Saudis demand a reliable defense agreement with the United States, something similar, in their perception, something similar to that of Japan and South Korea. So a major non-NATO ally status or something like that, or maybe even stronger. And the third point is that the Saudis have long wanted to start a civilian nuclear program, a small one. And the issue is if they can get it now. But the problem is that Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, in several speeches in the past few years have stated that if Iran gets nuclear weapons, then we are going to get nuclear weapons too. So I think that these are the issues, once again, most modern weapons, reliable defense, and the nuclear program. These are the issues which will be or which would be very difficult for any US government to pass in Congress, in the US Congress. And not to mention the fact that we are now in an election year, and not to mention the fact that we have 2 presidential candidates, neither of whom may take this on his own. And the Saudis have learned from the Iranian nuclear deal's example that it is not enough if such a deal would be declared by a presidential decree, because as President Obama declared the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, with a presidential decree. Donald Trump, the next president, could withdraw it with a presidential decree. So the Saudis have learned, they listened and they learned, and they want everything credibly. And this is their demands towards the United States. And as I said, the Palestinian statehood has come back to lead the agenda, and the Saudis will demand also credible pathways, not even a roadmap, but more than that in this regard too.
Japan has recently begun to take up a more active role in the Middle East and North Africa. Where does it stand with Saudi Arabia, Professor Cziczmann?
That's a very important question. I think Japan is not a newcomer in terms of economy because it has the largest economy of the world still. And it's important to mention, especially since the 1973 oil crisis, Japan is very much dependent on Middle Eastern fossil fuels. And especially here, Saudi Arabia has been playing a key role in providing Japan with oil. Still, Japan is among the five highest, most important trading partners of Saudi Arabia. But as you rightly pointed out, that very recently Japan became more active in the region, not only in terms of economy, but security, technology-related issues. And we have to mention that Japan has joined the Saudi Vision 2030 policy, in which Japan has decided to provide Saudi Arabia with the latest technology and to help in diversifying the Saudi economy. So it seems there is a plenty of opportunity for cooperation in the region. Plus, we have to add that Japan a few years ago has joined a maritime security force with the aim of maintaining the free shipping of oil, which is of course important for Japan's too, not only for China or India, to secure the oil shipment route in the Bab el-Mandeb and the Indian Ocean territories. So for instance, I would say it seems that China has become more and more active, not only in terms of economy, but technology related and security related issues. Of course, Japan has its own limits on security related issues because of the constitutions, but we see change not only in Japan, but the entire Indo-Pacific with the geopolitical context. And of course, because China now is a very active player in the region, it's important somehow to contain a bit China's role in the region. However, in economic terms, we see some complementary issues because both China and both Japan has been relying on Saudi oil. So for both countries, it's important to secure the oil shipment route from the Middle East, from the Strait of Hormuz through the Strait of Malacca, which securities could be questioned as well.
What about India? The two countries have traditionally been strong business and political partners, but more recently, Saudi Arabia has kept surprisingly silent about Narendra Modi's approach towards the country's Muslim population, while India has backed up Saudi Arabia on the international scene concerning the Yemeni conflict a number of times. How would you characterize this relationship, and where is it heading, Professor Csicsmann?
That's a very important question, I think, because especially under the Modi administration since 2014, we see a more active engagement with the west of India, with the Middle East, and especially with two countries, the United Arab Emirates and Israel. India has signed a strategic partnership agreements in terms of a lot of things. Saudi Arabia is at the moment not part of it, but we see that relations getting closer and closer. And we have to emphasize that a few months ago, last year in September, there was the G20 summit in New Delhi, where the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor was announced with the support of the United States. And the aim is to build an infrastructure, mainly a road infrastructure from United Arab Emirates through Saudi territory to Jordan, Israel, reaching the Mediterranean Sea. It's a very important issue. The United States observe it like an alternative to the BRI. Of course, India's approach is a bit different from this perspective, but I think it could be a solution to the current problem in the Red Sea as well, to have an alternative route to the Bab el-Mandeb and Suez Canal. And at this very moment, especially as I mentioned, the United Arab Emirates, they built a lot of infrastructure right now. It just only the question is, of course, the 7th of October conflict between Israel and Hamas and the recent escalation escalation, maybe it could prevent to implement this strategy of the IMEC, India Middle East Economic Corridor. Regarding the Muslim population, it's important to mention at the same time that around 9 million Indians based in the Persian Gulf, with the largest number in the United Arab Emirates. And of course, for many years, for many decades, Saudi Arabia mainly supported Pakistan in the conflict between India and Pakistan, but recently remained silent because India now is a global player, and engaging with a global player is very important for both for the Saudis. And again, we have to mention that India is relying on the same Middle East energy, fossil fuel. It's very much the same like in the case of Japan or China. India is geographically closer to the Middle East, so it's, very natural to deepen the relations between the two regions. And of course, as Saudi Arabia is the leading force in the region, definitely the relations should be upgraded, I think, quite soon, and focusing more and more on technology-related issues, defense issues as well. And I think a lot of common shared interest we have here.
How about Saudi Arabia's complex relationship with Qatar?
Yes, the relationship is very complex because, as we have mentioned, the Gulf Arab states established the so-called GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is mostly a political, economic, and to a certain extent, security cooperation. And tiny Qatar, which is one of the small Arab states, tiny Qatar has started to independently play a political role, and this independent role not necessarily coincided with the Arab GCC member states. However, we have to emphasize that the GCC is not a homogeneous organization. We have Saudi Arabia, which is by far the biggest. Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates usually and historically work together with Saudi Arabia. However, there are cases where Saudi and the Emirati interests are colliding, and they may even have different political goals and aims. Kuwait and Oman traditionally like to stay on the sidelines of controversies. Kuwait, because it is stuck in between the three great regional powers in the northern part of the Persian Gulf. Oman, as has been traditionally always the peacemaker, the quiet and peaceful state in the region, while Qatar has started to lead such political issues which were strange, to say the least. On the one hand, Qatar is very rich in gas, not necessarily oil, but gas, and Qatar is sharing probably the biggest gas field under the water of the Persian Gulf with Iran. So Qatar and Iran are forced to cooperate to a certain extent. And when the Saudi-Iranian relations were cut and turned towards the worst, then Qatar could not follow the Saudi lead and could not leave Iran there because they had a very practical reason to cooperate. The other thing is that was taken badly by the Saudis, that Qatar provides the place to many outcast personalities and outcast organizations within the region, personalities like famous preachers or the Muslim Brotherhood, the organization of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they even get pride time on the Jazeera, the TV channel that everyone has heard about. So there were these problems, and Qatar provides a home to the Afghan Taliban as well. And this made it possible for Qatar to provide the sphere and the environment for US-Taliban negotiations a few years ago. On the same way, now now with regard to the Gaza war, many of the political leadership of the Hamas are living now in Qatar. And this again provides Qatar a possibility, an option to provide a channel for communication between the conflicting parties, which is not taken nicely usually. So when the relations between Qatar and Saudi Arabia came to a breaking point, I think it was in 2016, then the other 5 states of the GCC provided Qatar 12 conditions, isolated Qatar within the GCC, and they provided 12 conditions if Qatar wants to come back to the GCC fold. And it was not very easy because Qatar is a peninsula. It has a very tiny land border with Saudi Arabia. And for example, such simple things that shepherds who were leading the cows that were later on used in the Qatari food industry, they were shepherding the cows on the Saudi side of the border. Then it was closed, then they have to be sent back, or what happens? Qatari airspace was closed down, and everyone knows, I think, that Qatar Airways is one of the leading airlines of the region. So Qatar became isolated very strictly, very severely, both on land and in the air, also mostly on the sea. And then there were 2 countries which came to the help, and it was Turkey and it was Iran. And this doesn't mean that Turkey and Iran would be very, very beneficially seen in Qatar, but at this point of harshness, they came to help. And the result was that Turkey, for the first time probably in history, I don't remember that even in Ottoman history, there would have been a naval military base of Turkey in Qatar. Now we do have a few thousands, if I'm not mistaken, like 5,000 Turkish soldiers, troops in Qatar. But the interesting issue, or maybe even the anecdotal issue, was that even the United States, Donald Trump was visiting, and he said that Qatar was a state that was supporting terrorism, and then his advisors quietly made him aware of the fact that there are 10,000 US troops stationed in Qatar. So it would be very nice if you, Mr. President, would not cut all the ties with Qatar. So yes, relations were soon turned for the better. But to end the story, because of these specific capabilities of Qatar, which are the main charges against Qatar, that it is hosting organizations like Hamas and the Taliban, partly because of this, or maybe mainly because of this, Qatar could come back in 2021 to the GCC at the Al-Ula meeting without fulfilling any of the 12 conditions that were put to it for coming back. So it is very interesting. And one more thing happened, that all through these few years, 5 years, during the course of Qatar's isolation, a very specific Qatari nationality built up in Qatar, which was not there. Of course, anyone who travels around the region knows that the photos of the leaders are usually in every shop and they are on display. But in Qatar, this was also so. The young Emir Tamim, who has just a few years before came to the throne of Qatar, taking it over from his father, has appeared everywhere and on several stories high buildings, let's say 4-story big photos, and there was a huge poster put out where Qataris went and signed it up, and in the end they had to use ladders to climb up to find empty place to sign up for the young emir. And so I think that a very distinctive Qatari nationalism has built up, which is centered around the personality of the emir, but it includes several issues. And we also have to mention that Qatar has somehow and not only found, but also has come to implement its unique and specific way of doing foreign policy.
We obviously cannot have a conversation about Saudi Arabia's foreign relations without talking about Yemen. The complex historical ties between the two countries, the seemingly never-ending Yemeni armed conflict in which Saudi Arabia keeps playing a significant role, and possible scenarios for future development. However, we believe this issue is worth a podcast on its own. So please stay tuned for our following podcast on this and other intricate topics concerning the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. Thank you, Dr. Erzsébet N. Rózsa. Thank you, Professor László Csicsmann, for being with us today, and I'm looking forward to all of our next podcasts.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the Khayriyan podcast. We are looking forward to sharing with you more exciting news on the politics and business of the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. For further information, please follow us at khayriyan.com, as well as on X and LinkedIn.